Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Del. And thank you for coming back to listen to this week's episode of Press the Button. There's a lot happening this week. We're going to discuss what's happening with Iran, both in the Senate and in their centrifuges. And we're going to discuss the historic visit over the weekend by President Donald Trump to North Korea, where he met with Kim Jong-un. Next up, I sat down with Jon Wolfsthal, the director of the Nuclear Crisis Group and former special assistant and senior director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. Wow, what a title, under President Barack Obama. We covered a lot of ground, including lessons learned from his time in the White House and what that tells us about what Democrats should do next time should they get the White House. What are the lessons learned from his time with the Obama administration that might inform how to reframe U.S. nuclear posture? If you like what you hear, please give us a comment, share the episode, better yet, subscribe and rate the episode. We'd love to hear from you, our listeners. It really helps us out. But now, the news.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm here with our Deputy Director for Policy, Mary Kaszynski, and our Roger Hale Fellow, Catherine Killough. We're going to talk about two very significant events this week. The one is what's happening with Iran, both the vote in the Senate and Iran's announcement that it's breaching one of the technical limits of the Iran anti-nuclear accord. But we're going to start, Catherine, with you about the historic visit by President Trump to the DMZ and across the DMZ to meet with North Korean leader Kim. What's your takeaway from that? Was this a photo op, a reality TV event, all flash in the pan? Or does this mean that we're restarting negotiations that could actually get somewhere? What matters most to you?
Well, it's all of that, but I think what matters most to me is really the reaction I've heard from the Democrats. My fear is that in their criticisms of President Trump, they are essentially boxing themselves in the event that we do see a Democrat in office. Just to give you an example of the kind of responses that we heard, and I'm not going to name who this candidate is because...
Can I guess?
You can guess. But this is sort of the template for criticizing Trump and his diplomatic outreach. Our president shouldn't be squandering American influence on photo ops and exchanging love letters with a ruthless dictator. Instead, we should be dealing with North Korea through principled diplomacy that promotes U.S. security, defends our allies, and upholds human rights.
Okay, what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with this is that, first of all, if your only talking points on North Korea are in the context of criticizing Trump, then these sort of calls for principled diplomacy starts to sound like what we have been doing, the status quo. And when you look at what we have been doing, we've had a policy of isolation, an over-reliance on maximum pressure and sanctions, and essentially we are completely rebuffing our South Korean allies who want to see a U.S. president engage directly with
So President Moon of South Korea, did he welcome these talks? And I saw him standing next to Trump. He seemed pleased by this meeting.
Yes, in fact, they invited Trump to South Korea expressly for the purpose of jumpstarting this stalled process. I think, the hope was always to have this trilateral leader summit, and they essentially got that.
I see. So what you're saying is that there's not a problem meeting with dictators. It's whether these meetings advance American interests, whether they advance American values. And this criticism seems to be boxing the Democrats in. Like, no, you shouldn't be meeting with a ruthless dictator. So what does that mean if they're in the White House and they meet with this ruthless dictator? Is that also the wrong thing to do?
That was the point that Bernie Sanders was making, is that he actually wants President Trump to meet with the leaders of Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, because we have real issues with these countries, and the only way we're going to fix them is by meeting with them face to face. Now, I understand the criticisms of the style, the way that President Trump has been going about this process, but I think in their haste to oppose Trump, Democrats have completely forgotten their own legacy as being the first to actually negotiate a U.S.-North Korea nuclear deal that Republicans, in fact, killed.
Right, exactly right. Okay, we're going to get back to North Korea if we have a little more time, but I want to switch over to Iran because there's a lot going on. So, Mary, Iran has now exceeded the 300-kilogram limit. They're slowly accumulating this amount of low-enriched uranium, but that they're a long way from a bomb. This is not a sprint to a bomb. This seems to me to be more of a negotiating tactic. Is that the way you see it?
Absolutely. And I think this has really been missed in the debate about what Iran is doing and, building up leverage and, the tankers and all of that. What's missing here is that Iran is very clearly gearing up for new negotiations. This is Iran building up leverage that they don't really care about. They don't care if they have 300 kilograms of LEU or 500 kilograms or 10,000 kilograms.
Right.
They don't really care. They can trade it away.
Right. Let me just, for people who don't realize this, before the Iran anti-nuclear agreement, they had 10,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. They shipped all of it out of the country. They were left with this token amount of 300. If they exceed it, if they go to 310, 320, 400, 500, it really doesn't matter. They're still at least a year away from being able to convert that into the core of a bomb. So this is a technical violation. We don't like it. It's regrettable, but it is not a military threat.
Exactly. And Iran has also responded very, very slowly. They could have taken this step immediately when Trump violated the nuclear accord last year. That was an entire year ago. Mm-hmm. Iran held on. They've been very restrained. They've been moving very slowly. Now, they could take another very serious step and move beyond the low-enriched uranium limit and start enriching past that. That would be a much more serious step. But again, the steps that Iran is taking so far are very minor, and these are things that Iran could easily trade away if there's an administration that is willing to come back into compliance with the nuclear agreement and start negotiating with Iran again.
So does this, though, play into Trump's hands? I mean, it seems that we wanted to goad Iran into leaving the deal so that we could justify military action. But on Friday, the Senate, at least 50 senators, voted to block any unauthorized war with Iran. How significant is that?
Exactly. Well, despite what Trump says, John Bolton very clearly wants a war with Iran. Administration officials have said that they might use the 2001 AUMF to justify military action against Iran that is not authorized by Congress. There's a lot of concern about this on the Hill, and that's why the Senate voted last week. 50 senators voted to prohibit funding for unauthorized use of force against Iran.
And next week, the House gets a chance.
Exactly. There's an amendment to the annual defense bill offered by Representatives Ro Khanna, Representative Brown, Chairman Engel, Chairman Smith. It has about 30 co-sponsors right now. It's coming up for a vote next week. The House is very likely to pass this limitation on the Trump administration's ability to start a war with Iran.
Look, the sirens are going to cut us off any minute. But Catherine, right before we go, I just want to know, are you expecting that we actually will begin negotiations again with North Korea? Can Steve Biegun get us a deal?
Yes, we already have. We saw Steve Biegun there in Seoul right before Trump arrived.
And not John Bolton, interesting.
Not John Bolton. And at one point, Trump pointed to Steve Biegun and said, "That's my guy."
That's my guy. All right, let's hope the best. Here comes it. We are out of time. I'm so sorry, but join us again next week when we will have an exclusive interview with Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Representative Anthony Brown, to talk about his amendment to stop this unauthorized war against Iran. Thank you. We're in the Glass Enclosed headquarters of Ploughshares Fund in Washington, D.C., and I'm with my friend and longtime colleague, Jon Wolfsthal, who's left the Obama administration with the most impressive title of Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in the National Security Council. Wow, quite a title, Jon. How'd you get that?
Well, the more words in your title, the lower the pay. I was a very fortunate guy. I had worked on the Obama campaign, but Joe, as you know, because we've worked together, I've been in Washington a long time working on these issues. And I think within Democratic policy circles, people know that I know the substance very well and that I've been working this a long time. So when the Obama administration was developing its list of personnel, I got approached by an old colleague, Tony Blinken, who became the vice president's national security advisor and eventually the deputy secretary of state, asked whether I'd like to work for the vice president as his advisor for nuclear policy. And I said, well, let me think about that for 1 nanosecond. Yes, that'd be great. I'd be happy to come work for the vice president. And so I did that job for about 3 years. And then I left for a couple of years, as you know, moved to California with my family, and then moved back in 2014, and a couple of months later rejoined the administration at the National Security Council.
That's great. That's great. So you were working very closely on the Obama administration's nuclear policy.
Right. Really from really on the campaign, helping to develop ideas and feed them into the campaign and the candidate's speech.
Right. We did that together.
That's right.
After you left the Hillary campaign.
It's even worse than that. I'd been on the Obama campaign and then got offered a job on the Hillary campaign. I was like, well, that's a much better play. I'm going to take that job. So that didn't work out.
And I was working on the Obama for President campaign, I think in 2007. So I was happy to welcome you. Where you quickly pushed me aside and started setting the nuclear policy for the campaign.
I don't know if that's quite true, but the point is, a good candidate will broaden the tent, and they will bring in everybody who wants to work for victory, and the smartest people will go and accept that.
Yeah, great. What I want to do is talk to you about what you learned on the job and what lessons this has for what we should be doing next. If a new president is elected in 2020, what should he or she be doing now to prepare for the nuclear policy, and what do you have to do when you get into office? So let's just start broadly. What are some of your big takeaways of lessons learned, looking back on the experience in the Obama administration? What advice would you have broadly for the new administration?
I think at the broadest level is nothing will change unless the president wants it to change. The status quo of maintaining large nuclear forces, having diversified nuclear triad, spending $50 billion a year on nuclear forces, all of that is institutionalized. And unless the White House and the president seizes control of this agenda and requires and demands change, those forces will hold steady. There could obviously be changes at the margins, and we're seeing that now, just as we saw changes at the margin under the Obama administration. But unless the president wants change and directs it to happen, things are going to stay pretty much the way they are.
Yes, Ben Rhodes was talking to us about this in a previous podcast about the equities involved and how Department of Defense, for example, wants to maintain maximum flexibility, offer the president as many options as possible. And the only thing that changes that is the president saying, no, I want to do things differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I listened to the podcast. It was great to hear Ben, talk about these issues. And we all have different memories because we worked at different levels. Ben, obviously, at a much higher level, closer to the president and the principals, and many more conversations than I. I really had a ground level grunt view at what was going on inside the nuclear complex. And that's right. The Pentagon and Strategic Command, their job is to have options available should the president want them. They rarely get to ask the president, do you want these options? And even to the last day of the administration, I was convinced President Obama would have been happy to shed many of those options. And at times when he was focused on the agenda, I think did move in certain directions, but that was not widely supported inside the administration. You did have different cabinet secretaries and sub-cabinet actors with different equities that didn't always either agree with the president or felt the president wasn't really clear with what he wanted. And as a result, we had to fight tooth and nail for every option, idea, proposal to get up to the president for his consideration. And that's a very slow, laborious process.
Shed some of these options, you mean first use of nuclear weapons, prompt launch, would somebody say hair trigger alert?
Sure. De-alerting, taking warheads off of ICBMs in peacetime. We ran through a wide variety of options when we looked at both the Prague speech and how we might implement it over time. And every one of those ideas, big, like de-alerting or taking down a wing of an ICBM, if you don't need 450 ICBMs,
right,
maybe 300 is plenty, or no first use, or even down to small options. Can we retire this warhead we don't need anymore? Can we shift this from the reserve pile, the just-in-case pile, to the let's get rid of them pile? We would be fought tooth and nail on that.
But why? Who would fight you on that? I mean,
so
DOE, DOD, the military itself, the labs, who?
All of the above. When we would go, I'll give you an example. We talked about, in fact, we announced that we were going to retire all of the B-83, the last megaton weapon in the U.S. arsenal.
Right, largest bomb in the arsenal, hydrogen bomb.
That's right. That was, at one point, needed to hold certain targets at risk. That's about as far as I'll go with that. We said, well, look, we're building these new airdropped weapons, the B-61 Mod 12. It's going into the arsenal. It's been certified. It's reliable. So let's get rid of the weapon it's designed to replace. And people say, well, maybe we might need a few of those, or we have those options in the war plan. If we take them out, we have to change the war plan again. If we slate them for dismantlement, then it will go into the logistics queue, and that will screw up our timeline for modernizing new weapons. We'd rather modernize new ones than get rid of old ones. There'll be costs associated with that. So there were just complexities. And quite frankly, a lot of the military, the laboratory, the Department of Energy complex said, well, why is a political appointee at the White House getting involved in our business? And they sometimes forget that I was the representative of the president. I wasn't a political appointee getting their business. I was trying to present options to the president, and part of their job is to be responsive to those requests.
So this, I guess, nuclear bureaucracy, right, would slow everything down, resist, try to keep things the way they are. This is, by the way, across the board, almost everywhere?
I want to be careful because clearly people wanted to be responsive to the president. And if we asked for information, we would get it. If we wanted to prepare a paper for the president or for cabinet members, we would get information that we needed. There was an honest political process at work. But at the same point, we ran an open, honest process. We weren't going to send something to the president that said, having these weapons is a bad idea without laying out the counter arguments. We had a responsibility to lay out the pros and the cons, and often the cons would come from very high up inside the nuclear bureaucracy at either Stratcom or the Pentagon or Department of Energy. And in order to override them, you then had to get the president's time. The most valuable commodity in any administration is the time of the president. And it would take weeks, sometimes months, to get onto the president's schedule because he's doing a lot of other things like negotiating and trying to get the Iran deal in place, responding to Russian interference in our election or the invasion of the Crimea, drawing down troops in Afghanistan or Iraq. There's always competition for what the president's going to focus on.
So, like pushing any bureaucracy, the number one lesson here is that the president has to care about it. These are the president's weapons. They have to be a presidential priority to change weapons policy.
I think that's right. And it's not just that it has to have the president's attention, but he has to stay on top of the process.
Let me ask you about another layer of resistance that you found, which is Congress. There is something, and people don't know about this, called the ICBM caucus in the Senate. And you encountered that firsthand when you were trying to win ratification for the New START treaty, or even negotiating New START. Some of the concerns that senators had who were representing states where there were ICBM fields. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we were negotiating New START, the vice president, who was heavily involved in the process and has strong relationships with his former colleagues in the Senate, got calls and would hold meetings with people from Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, even Utah, where ICBM rocket motors are made, saying, well, if the treaty restricts warheads, we don't want them to come out of the ICBM force, make them come out of the sub force. Or if they're going to come out of the ICBM force, don't pick on any one state. Draw down proportionally across states so that we would maintain 3 bases instead of 2 or 1. Their arguments weren't about nuclear strategy. Their arguments weren't about what's the best way to negotiate an agreement. It was about local politics. The base provides jobs, provides income, it provides families coming into these rural states, and they wanted to preserve that pork, quite frankly.
So what should a new president do if they want to recognize those members' concerns? I'm being as polite as possible here. Do you have to have a strategy for providing an alternative revenue stream to Montana?
Yeah, I think you do. And if you want to put it in very blunt terms, you have to buy off the states for their acquiescence. The good news is this is really doable. After I left government, I looked at some of the numbers on what the bases in these states actually provide. At Minot Air Force Base, it's a joint base, both bombers and ICBMs. The total annual income, both in terms of investment, construction, and salaries, is less than 0.5% of the North Dakota GNP. And the average job at Minot is paid 40% less than the average job in the oil and gas industry in North Dakota. So the senators want the bases because they have the bases and they think it's good for stability. But the reality is that these are relatively low-cost decisions when you look at the overall cost of the nuclear arsenal. As you know, the United States is going to spend $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to maintain and modernize its nuclear forces. The ICBM force alone, just the missiles and the cost of maintaining them over 30 years is about $120 billion.
Current estimates, and that's going to go up, as Adam Smith always says.
That's right. So you could get rid of one base for a couple $100 million, maybe $500 million invested over 5 years to do job retraining. But that's a different budget line item.
You know, this is something I don't think any president has ever actually come in with. And I think it's been part of the missing equation, that you have to have this. It's not just a strategic debate. It's a congressional concern. It's a parochial debate. You have to address the equities that senators have, and you can do it as long as you have a plan for it.
I think that's right. I think it's also just you have to have the knowledge base. And so, you know, one of the things that, quite frankly, the Obama administration didn't have, at least in the camp where Ben Rhodes and myself and I think the president wanted to go on nuclear policy, is we didn't have a Frank Miller. We didn't have somebody who had been in the nuclear bureaucracy for 20 years at the Pentagon, in the military, in the nuclear world, that knew exactly how to write the employment guidance, that knew how to write the language in the presidential decision directive to the agencies to get these changes done. If you remember, one of the criticisms early on in the Obama administration is the president knows how to give great speeches, but he didn't know how to actually change nuclear policy. And we saw many times in other fields, the military try to do an end run on the Pentagon. If you look at the troop surge in Afghanistan, or why the vice president got involved in looking at counterinsurgency strategies, the system was set up to protect certain options. And we really didn't have people now like me who know how the system works and, quite frankly, can be much more effective the second time around, because we didn't have those people in place.
Okay, so this is the third lesson. The first is presidential priority. Second is dealing with congressional parochial concerns. 3 is get the right personnel into the right positions. And go ahead.
Yeah, I think they have to be in the right positions. I think they have to have access to the National Security Advisor and the president on a regular basis. And quite frankly, they can't just be sprinkled in. They really need to be at every agency. You need to have somebody not just at the White House, but also at the Pentagon, also at the State Department, also in the Department of Energy, who have direction from the president. Make this happen. Bring me options in 30 days. How are we going to get this done? What's the level of forces that we need to maintain? How do we get rid of the rest? How do we change the mentality? And this is really, I think, what it goes down to. How do we change the mentality that nuclear weapons are not a source of our security, but nuclear weapons are the source of our insecurity? This was in the Prague speech, and it never translated into the nuclear bureaucracy. And if you want change, it really has to come from a change of mindset.
And how about at the cabinet level?
So at the cabinet level, I think you saw the only useful thing I learned in graduate school come to the fore, which is where you stand depends on where you sit. You had the Secretary of Defense trying to preserve options for the use of military force.
Whoever the Secretary of Defense was.
That's exactly right.
From 3 or 4 of them?
Secretary Gates, Secretary Hagel, Secretary Carter.
Wasn't Panetta in the mix?
Secretary Panetta, although I was out of government
there
for a brief period of time. I was in Monterey when he was here. We sort of switched. Their job is to preserve deterrence and military options for the president. Their job is not to institute disarmament. Their job is not to push for arms control. Their job is to have the military ready to fight if and when it's needed. The State Department, this is where you really saw divides. You had the arms control bureaus, as you remember, the legacy of Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, now in the form of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, advocating for negotiations, reductions, leadership in nonproliferation and global affairs. You had the other part of the State Department that manages our bilateral relationships with key allies saying, well, wait, if we change any aspect of nuclear policy, then they might proliferate. They might get nuclear weapons.
We're introducing uncertainty into the alliance structure. We're going to be, people will question our willingness to Article 5.
That's right.
This all comes up, and it's always said great, usually baritone tone.
Very dramatic. Mr. President, if we do this, we can't predict the outcome.
Yes.
But the reality is there is not a personal constituency internationally for arms control or disarmament. But there are constituencies for maintaining alliance military capabilities and stability. And so when somebody, and I don't want to say who, leaked that the Obama administration was looking at whether no first use was the right option, we immediately got phone calls from allies.
Was this the Josh Rogan article? Anyway,
I think it was Josh Rogan.
You got calls.
We got
from
calls
allies.
from key allies. What are you doing? And we said, well, we're not doing anything. We're just looking it up. You couldn't possibly do this to us, particularly late in the administration. And our view was, well, we couldn't go to you unless we knew what we wanted to do first. But now you're saying that we can't decide what we want to do first without going to you. And that's exactly why the document was leaked. It was designed to torpedo the president's ability to consider his options.
Right, because when you're dealing with the allies, the defense ministries are usually fairly conservative, whether you're talking about United Kingdom or Japan or France. And so they're organized, and they just come in and they overwhelm you.
It's not even so much that they overwhelm us. They're legitimately concerned. I once described reassurance and extended deterrence as a bottomless bucket. No matter how much you pour into it, it's never going to be full. And so anything you try to change is going to create instability. And unless you've done your prep work, unless you've gone and talked to those offices and they know what you're trying to achieve and why, you're going to face resistance.
So let me ask you something here. I'll get back to the lessons learned, but is there a lesson learned from Trump here about just how strong the president can be, about if the president really wants to do something, they can overrule these allied concerns, these cabinet level concerns, and just go implement a policy. And you know what? The allies get used to it. The bureaucracies will take it. You just got to be willing to push hard enough and push fast enough.
I think there's a lesson, but I don't want to take it too far. I mean, on the one hand, yes, the president is the most powerful person in the free world and can make decisions and make them stick if he or she believes in them strongly. And I think there's a very good case for the United States dramatically reducing its reliance on nuclear weapons and dramatically reducing the risk of nuclear use in the world, which I think most sane people believe is far too high. But at the same point, we have to remember Donald Trump doesn't care about alliances. Donald Trump doesn't care about what our allies think. And so I think the real lesson here is if you care about something enough, you figure out a way to get it done. you can compensate for changes in American nuclear policy, just as we have for 70 years. Do you enhance your conventional deployments? Do you change your intelligence sharing, or do you change your military procurement patterns? Do you deploy different types of capabilities in different places to say that we don't need nuclear weapons, we can do it this way instead of that way? What the Allies want are not shiny objects. What they want are commitments from the United States that they can rely on. And I think the lesson of Donald Trump is that it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons we have, they don't reassure. The president and his or her commitment to our alliances is what reassures. And then if that's solid, the rest falls into place.
I really think that's golden. That's absolutely right. I mean, we used to have 25,000 weapons in our nuclear arsenal as late as the 80s. In fact, that's when we peaked. And the idea that we could cut any of them was dangerous, right? So we absolutely needed every single one of those 25,000 nuclear weapons until we didn't.
Right.
And now we're down to about 4,000 in the operational stockpile. Again, you hear the same arguments. You can't cut. No, we need more. We need more options. But we have to devise a plan that reassures our allies while you get down to something like 400.
So here's the example I would use here.
Okay.
The president, or at least the Pentagon, wants to build new low-yield nuclear weapons to put on submarines, the W-76-2, the D-5, because that will reassure our allies and deter Russia that a nuclear war won't be fought. At the same time, President Trump said, we want to negotiate new arms control agreements with Russia and with China to bring them into the fold. But he never thought to have a Secretary of State call France or the UK, whose nuclear forces are roughly the same size as China.
France is larger.
Who Russia said, well, if you want to bring in China, you better bring in France and the UK. And they were caught totally unaware that this was happening. So it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons we have, what size they are. If the president isn't going to act in a way that our allies believe supports them and that is committed to their security, no amount of nuclear weapons is going to fix it.
Okay, let's turn to what we should be doing now to prepare for this possibility that a new president comes in who has as her or his priority reducing nuclear risks, and they're determined to do it. How long, by the way, do you think they have when they come in? They're elected in 2020. They're inaugurated January 2021. Hit the ground running?
Yeah, I think if you don't have a plan in the transition team, you're already playing catch up. You have 3 months from the time the election takes place until you're sworn into office, and you have to know what you want to do, generally speaking, and how you want to get it done in the transition.
Okay, so we're in the middle of 2019. What should be happening now to prepare for this moment?
So what you need to do, and what some of us are already doing, is thinking through what are really the president's responsibilities when it comes to protecting America against nuclear dangers. How do you reduce the risk that a nuclear weapon will be used against us or our allies? How do you preserve and enhance strategic stability with Russia? How do you maintain deterrence at a lower level of nuclear forces? How do you spend money in the military on the things you actually need and not on an inflated nuclear complex that you can't really afford and doesn't make us any more secure? And how do you deal with less regional nuclear challenges in North Korea, in India, Pakistan, and quite frankly on Iran?
Right, so you integrate those regional nonproliferation, what people think of as nonproliferation, with your nuclear policy.
That's right, and that's part of what the Obama administration did in the beginning, where we said, if we want to have a nuclear deal with Iran, we can't be seen as the main source of nuclear instability in the world. Think back to 2008, Joe, a long time ago. George W. Bush was seen as a nuclear cowboy.
Yes.
He wanted the robust nuclear earth penetrator. He wanted a whole new generation of new nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons.
New uses, expanding the use against
Interesting
conventional.
That John Bolton was deeply involved in those, and yet somehow these ideas have come back. And so President Obama when he gave the Prague speech, and I actually got this from your analysis years ago, it wasn't just about the details, it was resetting the frame through which the world saw the United States. We were no longer the source of nuclear instability. We were reclaiming our mantle of protecting against nuclear dangers. And it's for that reason that we got global support for sanctions on Iran, because we were no longer the problem. They were the ones that were violating the norms.
Exactly. It all worked together. Arms control works with nonproliferation. You have to be trusted by others that you're responsible with your nuclear weapons in order to gather global support for stopping other people.
As our old friend Mohammed al-Baradei said, you can't preach abstinence from a bar stool, right? You can't be seen as the most committed nuclear proliferator and get other countries to give up their nuclear capabilities.
Yes, right. Okay, so back to what should we be doing now?
So working with a number of people that have experience in government or who are likely to go back into a progressive administration, a number of us have begun to think through how these pieces fit together. How do you reassure our allies with a lower level of nuclear forces? How do you negotiate new deals with Russia in a way that our allies support, that enhances deterrence? How do you reset the nuclear weapons complex in a way that's sustainable, that doesn't buy capabilities we don't need? And then how do you begin to work with the allies so that they at least understand that there are likely changes coming down the road with American nuclear policy so that you could get their input and buy-in early as opposed to facing a brick wall of opposition down the line?
So do you have this plan?
So the plan's not in place, but the process is, where I'm now working with a bunch of people that I like, know, respect, or have worked with. We have about 40 people, 50-50 men and women, because we're committed to diversity in this process as well, to try and develop these different ideas. So we've begun talking about, what does it mean to get back into the JCPOA, the Iran deal? It's not just enough to rejoin the current deal. What's the future of U.S. engagement on nonproliferation and nuclear norms with Iran? How do you use the opening that Donald Trump has created in personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, but to actually get something done?
Right.
I mean, what if Donald Trump actually had a national security team that was committed to making progress and knew what they were doing?
Right.
The next president doesn't have the hurdle of meeting with Kim Jong-un.
And then how about our nuclear policy, weapons policy?
So on weapons policy, I think it's at least a two-step process. We've begun to talk through what's needed for deterrence. How do you salvage New START, if there's anything left to salvage? And how do you begin broadening the strategic stability dialogue with Russia, including not just nuclear reductions, but discussions on strategic stability, missile defenses, conventional precision strike capabilities? This has to be part of the dialogue with Russia, or you're not going to get anywhere. And then how do you begin creating space for that dialogue?
So do you have the prospect of building a consensus on these?
There is no, and there has never been a consensus on U.S. nuclear policy from the beginning. The scientists who built the bomb in the Manhattan Project opposed its use on Hiroshima.
Yes.
So consensus is not the right goal. The question is whether or not you have a logical, intellectually respectable position that you can support with evidence. And if you don't, then you're just dealing with theology. But quite frankly, nuclear deterrence as it exists today is as much theology as it is evidence-based.
So the goal is to develop a cadre of people who have these views, are clear on them, that can be tapped by an incoming administration or the candidate.
That's right. So at the very least, the candidate will know what their options are. And if we're fortunate enough to have another president with some vision and who wants to achieve real change and reduce these nuclear dangers, that they can pick it up and run with it.
Let me move through quickly some of the other elements of that. So then, but how about a plan itself, the detailed kind of plan? I mean, the Global Zero has put out an alternative nuclear posture review. That kind of thing?
So that's actually one of the starting points for our group, is to look at really what is, I can say it's a spectacular piece of work because I didn't work on it. Bruce Blair and our team, Emma Claire Foley and Jessica Slight, developed this. It basically takes the president's own guidance. What do I need nuclear weapons for? What targets do I have to hold at risk? And Bruce Blair, a former Minuteman III launch officer, works through and says, how can we achieve that with the minimum number of forces necessary? And he does it with a much smaller nuclear force, basically a submarine force of 5 submarines and a handful of bombers that could go nuclear in a crisis if you needed it, and they could still achieve the same deterrence goals as what we now are told you have to have 1,550 offensive nuclear weapons to achieve. So that's the starting point, and it includes in it no first use, which is that the United States would not need to use nuclear weapons force, and changes in the arsenal that back up that policy with real force changes. The follow-on, however, is understanding how do you actually write the guidance to the Secretary of Defense and the Commander of Strategic Command to get that done. In the Obama administration, and they were very responsive. General Kaler was an incredibly valuable partner, always above board. Admiral Winnefeld, the same, responsive, informed, gave the president what he wanted. But we didn't have the internal expertise to write that guidance for him. They came back and said, well, what you really want is this, and then you need to include this phrase, and then if you give us this guidance, we'll be able to do that. And what we ended up with was guidance that looked remarkably similar to what we inherited, which is that nuclear forces are to do 3 things: deter, reassure, and if deterrence fails, to fight and prevail in a nuclear war and to limit the damage that can be done to the United States. And that is backwards. U.S. nuclear forces should be set at the level needed to deter. From there, you then can figure out, how do we use those forces to reassure our allies? How do we use those forces should deterrence fail? But right now, we have many more nuclear forces than we need to deter. The Joint Chiefs says this openly.
Yes.
Deterrence you can achieve at a very low level.
They did a study that said we could cut our nuclear forces by 1/3, no matter what the Russians did, and still accomplish all our military missions.
That's exactly right.
We've forgotten about that study.
Does anybody think that it takes more than 100 or 200 or 300 warheads to threaten total destruction of Russia?
Right.
Of course not. But when you say, well, we want to come down below 1,550 or 1,000, then the State Department gets involved and says, oh, but our allies will get nervous. How do we reassure if we start to go down to the level of China?
So that's why you say start backwards. First, set the military requirement. How many to deter? Then we can work out the rest. Great.
Because it turns out you can achieve assurance and damage limitation with other means.
Yeah. Finally, public support for this. Tell me a little bit about what you think needs to be done between now and the election, between now and the inauguration, on the public side of this.
So, a lot. I'm actually amazed. Politico just did a question and answer session pulling in what the candidates have said on 50 different issues. Not one of them relates to whether or not the president would use nuclear weapons or how many nuclear weapons we need. The number one existential threat to the United States, the possibility that we could get into a nuclear war, didn't rise to the level of being raised in these Q&A. So I think, quite frankly, the media needs to do a better job of actually asking candidates, what do they think about nuclear weapons? How many do we need? Would they ever use them? If so, in what circumstances? Even Donald Trump got asked about this during the campaign by Chris Matthews, and he gave a nonsensical answer, which it turns out reflected his actual views, which are not nonsensical. So I think a lot more attention needs to be paid to this.
Yeah.
Very few voters will decide their vote based on it, but I think voters have a right to know what their next president might think about how to use the president's weapons.
Yes. Well, John, there's no siren blaring now, but we're out of time. And I regret that because there's a whole lot more to say. So
how do I download the extended version or the extended remix of this?
Good idea. We'll work on that.
You get people to pay extra for the outtakes.
If people, where can people write for more information? If they want to get the Global Zero Nuclear Posture Review, where do they go?
It's very simple. They can go to globalzero.org. They can follow Global Zero on Twitter, or if you want to really get some snarky comments, you can follow me at JB Wolfsthal on Twitter.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Always great to see you, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Megan McCall. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.